Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today is the last day of our final exam review. We will be covering all material that was found throughout the fourth quarter here. Couple things to keep in mind. Your textbooks will be due. I'll need to make sure that you get those into me prior to next week. It is important, otherwise, you'll be put on the obligation list. And if you don't have the right number that I have, you'll be charged an absurd amount of money for a textbook that isn't really worth that much money. So please make sure you get those turned into me by next week, somehow, some way. Much appreciated. Make sure your name is somewhere on the front cover of the textbook. So let's get in and start with our final review for our test tomorrow. So, Article 2 of the Constitution created the executive branch. And inside the executive branch, you will find our President of the United States, or the POTUS. There have been 46 presidents of the United States since George Washington. Prior to that, the first president of the United States under the Articles of Confederation was a man by the name of John Hanson. But the qualifications that we've set forth for the president include that they have to be a natural born citizen. They have to be natural born. They can't be born outside of the United States unless they're born in a territory or a military base. They have to be a resident here for at least 14 years, and they have to be a minimum age of 35 years of age at the time of the election. You get 4 years, 4 year terms. So you're allowed two 4 year terms right now. That's the max. FDR, of course, obliterated that. He was elected 4 terms, but you can actually serve 10 years as president. So if you're vice president for 2 years, the president passes away, you become president the last 2 years, then you're entitled to two more full terms. And that's how the Constitution works. So that's our executive branch. That's all I want you to know on the president. Article 2, 46 presidents. Current president, of course, we know is Joe Biden. Now, Article 1 of the Constitution is the legislative branch, and this was what we brought over with us through the Articles of Confederation. So, Article 1 dictates our Congress, and the first thing we'll talk about are the senators. So, to be a senator, you have to be a U.S. citizen, you have to be a resident for at least 9 years, you have to be a resident of the state for which you intend to represent, because here you're representing the entire state. You must be at least 30 years of age. Now, senators are elected for 6 year terms, but every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is up for reelection. That leaves 2/3 to do business. Their term limits are unlimited. They can serve for as long as they can get elected. That means that you could technically be in for life. So there are no other qualifications for that. And I'll have a few more things to say about the senators in an upcoming slide. Now, members of the House of Representatives, they're a little different because they need to be a U.S. citizen, but they only need to be a resident for 7 years. And they need to be a resident of the state in which they intend to represent, but they only have to be 25 years of age. So the requirements are 25 for a representative, 30 for a senator, and 35 for the president. Here you're elected for 2 years, which means that basically you're doing work for 1 year and then you're working on your campaign another year. The term limits are unlimited, but the problem again is you're always working on your election. Now, representatives, they represent a district within a state, just a district, and that's important to understand because a senator represents the entire state, a representative just a portion of that state. So let's talk about the Great Compromise. Something we learned about in the very beginning of the year. This is what created Congress. You've heard it several names. Let's look at all the names. You've heard it as Connecticut Compromise. You've heard it as the Sherman Compromise, Roger Sherman. You heard it as the small state versus the large state plan. So let's take a look at what the Great Compromise is and became. Because if you remember, the small states were worried that they weren't going to be heard, their voices wouldn't be heard. And that, of course, is what gave us our Senate. That's two people per state. 50 states, there's 100 total senators. And the large state plan wanted, massive representation based on population. What they came up with was a bicameral legislature, much like Parliament was in England, two houses, upper house, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons. So the House of Representatives would be much like the House of Commons, which you would have, well, we have 435 members today, and they would represent the common people. The House of Representatives, then, early on, they were in charge of then selecting our senators. Um, Not anymore. That all changed, but that's where the changes were. So the Senate acted as if they were much like the House of Lords. 100 members in the Senate, 435 in the House, 535 total members of Congress. Now, for famous early Americans, we could list a lot of people here. We really could, but we'll start with Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was an ambassador to France. He was the author of the Declaration, or one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence. Ben Franklin, everyone thinks he was a president because he's on the $100 bill, which is the highest denomination of bill that we have, and he was not a president. Ben Franklin was merely an ambassador. He was a brilliant, wise old man. Then you had Susan B. Anthony, who fought for women's rights, or what you know as suffrage. She was a women's activist. Thomas Jefferson was the pen of the Declaration of Independence, but he also was famous for expanding our country through the Louisiana Purchase, something he did not agree with, but something he went ahead and did anyhow. And finally, we finish with James Madison. He was the author and father of our Constitution and author of one of the authors, co author of the Federalist Papers that helped to forge our new Constitution, which was very important because without those Federalist Papers, people wouldn't know exactly what the Constitution was about. So he printed essay after essay after essay to get people to know and understand what the new government would be. Now, we talked about committees and a couple things here I want you to know. So they're made up of all the political parties. They're just not one committee of Democrats, one committee of Republicans or independents. No, they're a blend. Their goal in these committees is to determine the needs of the people. So eh, look at what's going on today, the pandemic. What do the people need? They need vaccinations, set up vaccination clinics. They need hospitals, set up hospitals. That's what the committees need to do. Their job is tasked with finding out the needs of the people and then addressing those needs. They also write new bills to address those problems. So one of the bills, of course, would be the stimulus checks that a lot of Americans received. Uh, Anything to help Americans, that's the goal or job of our Congress. Most members are on no more than 3 to 4 committees. Anything more than that, and that'd be cumbersome because they do a lot of work. Now, the 3 committee types that we went over before, there's a standing committee, and those standing committees deal with everyday issues. It could be pollution, it could be crime, it could be gun control, abortion. Those are the things that they deal with every day. Select committees are basically investigative issues. So you have something go wrong. Let's say when President Trump was dealing with his issues with Twitter and Facebook, they called these people in and they wanted to know what was going on. And the last one is joint committee. And the joint committee is made up of both houses of Congress. And pretty much the only reason they ever come together is when you have two of the same bill, but different versions, um, maybe different amendments, different riders, etc. And they'll come together and they'll work out and hammer out a compromise so that that bill will pass. Speaking of laws, we have laws because we have stupid people. Let's just face it. People do things that we dislike, the majority dislike it, and we make it a law. Um, Different types of laws that we put into effect, laws that affect our safety. So September 11th, you have the Patriot Act. Possibly you have how we change our ways at the airport, whether it's walking around barefoot so that they can check our shoes, our phone, etc. Those are just safety protocols that have been put in effect because of an incident. Then you have the welfare of the people. So you have laws because of welfare, the pandemic, you get the vaccinations, you get the government checks. And then lastly, government policy. And it defines what the people say is right. So when we talk about laws, who ultimately dictates what our laws say, and that would be the Supreme Court of the United States. They're the ones that interpret the laws, they're the ones that say what is right and wrong, and then we follow from there. Now, for something to become law, we have to have a bill first. There are over 11,000 bills that are sent through Congress every single year, and less than 4% are passed each year. Now, for a bill to pass or to be rejected, it goes to the president's desk. So the president is in charge of signing that bill. If he signs the bill, it's automatically a law. If he rejects it, that's known as a veto. And then it goes back to Congress and they can make changes and then introduce it again, or it just gets washed away. If it sits on the president's desk and he does nothing, it's considered a pocket veto if Congress is not in session. But if Congress is in session and it sits on his desk for 10 days, then it automatically becomes a law. Now, Congress can override a veto with a two-thirds vote, but that's really difficult to do because you don't usually get two-thirds to agree, especially with the number of um, Democrats and Republicans being pretty much even. And lastly, we've mentioned this before, either the Senate or the House can introduce bills to become laws. Now, we briefly started talking about discrimination before the PSS or before the Keystone exams hit last week. Uh, African Americans, discrimination, slavery, separate but equal. The Plessy versus Ferguson trial. When we talk about that, as long as blacks had the same sort of treatment as whites, then everything was supposed to be kosher. But that really wasn't the reality, especially if you looked at the drinking fountains or the bathrooms and the uses of facilities. Whites always had the better facilities, and African Americans had substandard. Then you have women who were discriminated against throughout history, less pay, the roles that they were forced to take or the jobs that they were forced to take. That's discrimination. Native Americans put on reservations. Asians, I have two types listed here. Japanese internment camps during World War II when we forced all Asians or all Japanese into internment camps. But the Chinese exclusionary law or act that we have here, this one stemmed from 1882, I believe, till 1943. And basically, we forbid any new Chinese from coming into this country. And then, of course, lastly, elderly discrimination by forcing elderly people into mandatory retirement. All right, let's finish up here with civil rights. So, Martin Luther King Jr., one of the activists throughout the 50s and 60s, assassinated. He advocated peaceful protest and the advancement of colored people through the NAACP. His speeches were about boycotting, having marches, or just being silent. He was a pacifist. Unfortunately, he was gunned down for his beliefs. He is the man who had the "I have a dream" speech. When we're dealing with civil rights, those are basically freedoms and protections by law. So you're trying to even the playing field, having equality, making everything equal, equal status, equal treatment. And of course, we need laws to do that because people don't play fair. We can see this in voting, facility use, treatment of each other. And lastly, all I want to mention, the 14th Amendment, which is the other half of due process, the 5th and 14th Amendment, it guarantees equal protection. So the Fifth Amendment, rights of the accused, 14th Amendment, equal protection. That's supposed to level the playing field for everybody. All right, Mount Pleasant, have a great day. Good luck on your test tomorrow.